the best biography ever written about John D. Rockefeller. And honestly, one of the greatest business biographies ever written is Chernow. Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller, Sr. It's 774 pages long, a monster of a book, and I've read it multiple times. And here's the thing, the more you read it, the more a very clear pattern begins to appear. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe, because every week we break down the minds of history's greatest builders and extract the principles you and I can actually use today. What people usually talk about, Standard Oil, monopoly, antitrust, the richest man in modern history, all of that actually distracts from what really made Rockefeller who he was. Because beneath the controversies, beneath the empire, beneath the mythology, there's something far more instructive. Rockefeller had an internal operating system built entirely around discipline, not motivation, not genius, not timing, discipline. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Because what emerges from Chernow's biographer, from Alan Evans's two-volume archival study, from letters, from journals, from interviews with people who worked with him, is that discipline wasn't a tactic Rockefeller used. Discipline was the foundation of his entire existence. It was the quiet force powering everything behind the scenes. And to understand how Rockefeller built what he built, we have to go back to where that discipline began, because it didn't come from wealth, education, or mentorship. It came from something much harsher, survival. Rockefeller grew up inside a household defined by contradiction. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, Big Bill, as people called him, was a traveling salesman, a charismatic fraudster, and an expert at disappearing for months, even years. His mother, Eliza, could not have been more different. Devout, calm, relentlessly organized. Chernow writes that she worshipped order the way some people worship religion, and that sentence captures the exact dynamic that shaped John's mind. Think about it, a child growing up with unpredictability on one side and rigid discipline on the other. And instead of becoming overwhelmed by that tension, Rockefeller absorbed the part that offered stability. He didn't inherit wealth, he inherited structure. He didn't inherit privilege, he inherited order. And that became his internal shield against chaos. This is why at 16 years old, when he earned his first paycheck as a bookkeeper, he didn't run off to celebrate. He didn't buy anything. He didn't even tell his friends. He walked home, sat at the kitchen table, opened a blank ledger, and wrote down every single cent. That quiet moment, a teenager documenting pennies, is one of the most important turning points in the history of American business, because Rockefeller would continue that ritual for decades. Not weeks, not months, decades. Every income, every expense, every debt, every investment, every donation, every line of credit, everything went into that ledger. People see that and think it's accounting. It's not. It's identity formation. It's a young man deciding, consciously or not, that discipline will be the weapon he uses to carve a future completely different from the one he was born into. Once you see that pattern, you realize something. Rockefeller didn't rise because he found opportunities. He rose because discipline allowed him to see opportunities others were too scattered to notice. When you read Rockefeller's biographies in chronological order, Nevin's Joja de Liberto's studies on Gilded Age families, you start to notice something fascinating. Rockefeller didn't stumble into discipline. He constructed it, piece by piece, habit by habit, decision by decision. And the real insight is this. His discipline did not begin in business. It began in how he trained his mind. Rockefeller had what his contemporaries called a two-speed mind. On the outside, he was calm, slow, measured. People said he spoke with a near whisper and rarely raised his voice. But internally, his thoughts were surgical, linear, almost mechanical. He had the ability to take chaos, break it into parts, and rebuild it into order. And that's exactly what he did with every part of his life. One of the most important early influences on him was something people rarely talk about. His first job. Rockefeller was hired as a bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tottle, a small produce brokerage in Cleveland. The work was tedious. Rows of numbers, ink-stained fingers, endless ledgers filled with cargo shipments, freight charges, and loan calculations. Most young men his age hated this kind of work. Rockefeller loved it because bookkeeping wasn't just accounting. It was discipline in its purest form. Rockefeller later said that bookkeeping taught him the underlying logic behind every transaction. And if you pay attention to his later decisions, you see the direct line from these ledgers to the empire he built. He learned how money really moved through a business, not in theory but in practice. He learned that numbers reveal what people hide. He learned that tiny inefficiencies compound into massive losses. And he learned that order, real order, creates power. But here's the thing that biographers emphasize over and over again. Rockefeller didn't just practice discipline, he applied it relentlessly to himself. He established what would become one of his most defining habits, the way he managed his emotions. Chernow writes that Rockefeller had an almost eerie inability to panic. This wasn't natural, it was trained. Rockefeller learned to slow his breathing, quiet his mind, and detach from emotional noise. He wrote, decades later, I always tried to turn disaster into opportunity and trouble into profit by never letting emotions outrun logic. This emotional discipline would become one of his greatest competitive advantages. While competitors reacted impulsively to market swings, Rockefeller stayed still. While others panicked during downturns, Rockefeller expanded. While rivals exhausted themselves in price wars, Rockefeller waited until they collapsed under their own chaos. And every time biographers trace one of these decisions, the chain leads back to the same root. Discipline in thought leads to discipline in action. Discipline in action leads to discipline in results. But the discipline extended far beyond his office. Rockefeller controlled not just his money and mind, but his entire environment. He woke early, he walked daily, he ate moderately, he avoided alcohol, he kept his office almost monkey-like in its simplicity. He wrote letters by hand meticulously. He tracked everything. He trimmed everything unnecessary. His life was a structure. By the time he was 20, his discipline was not a habit, it was a character. By the time he was 25, it was a strategy. By the time he was 30, it was a weapon. And by the time he built Standard Oil, it had become the foundation of an empire. As Rockefeller entered his 30s, something remarkable happened. Something every biographer points out, yet most people overlook. His discipline, which had started as a personal survival mechanism and later became a mental framework, finally crystallized into the engine of his business strategy. This is the moment where John D. Rockefeller stops being a determined young man and starts becoming Rockefeller. And it all begins with an industry that, on paper, made absolutely no sense. Oil refining. When Rockefeller first stepped into the oil business in the early 1860s, the industry was chaos. Boom and bust cycles happened monthly. Prices swung violently. Small operators opened and closed faster than newspapers could print the updates. Fortunes were made one week and lost the next. It was a gambler's paradise and a disciplined man's nightmare. But this is where Rockefeller's genius shows up. Where everyone else saw opportunity, Rockefeller saw disorder. Where everyone else chased fortune, Rockefeller chased structure. And that single difference changed American industry forever. Because while biographers describe the oil fields as ungovernable, lawless, and almost feral, Rockefeller didn't try to fight the chaos head. He did something far more strategic. He imposed discipline on an industry that had none. And this is the exact moment where you see the connection between the teenage bookkeeper tracking pennies and the adult businessman building an empire. Let me give you a few examples that Chernow and Nevins highlight repeatedly. Rockefeller brought cost discipline into a wild industry. Oil producers lived and died by luck. Refiners guessed, transporters guessed, everyone guessed. Rockefeller didn't guess. He calculated. He measured the cost of everything. Barrels credit, terms, transportation, waste byproducts, labor capital, flow, every penny mattered. And while competitors treated cost structure as an afterthought, Rockefeller treated it as scripture. Nevis hoche. Rockefeller brought order and calculation into a business ruled by speculation and waste. That's the turning point. 2. Discipline turned him into a master of margins. Rockefeller realized something almost nobody else saw. Oil refining is a margin business, and margins are ruled by discipline, not brilliance. He cut waste relentlessly, improved yields, streamlined workflows, reduced storage loss, controlled transportation rates. Most refiners left money on the table. Rockefeller picked it up. That's not genius. That's discipline applied to arithmetic. 3. Discipline made him trust data over emotion. When the Civil War ended, a massive recession hit. Investors panicked, prices collapsed, refineries shut down overnight. But Rockefeller expanded. Why? Because his ledgers told him something emotions couldn't. The only companies that survive chaos are the disciplined ones. His competitors felt fear. Rockefeller measured it. Cuatro. Discipline gave him the courage to consolidate. People forget this. Rockefeller didn't dominate the oil industry by brute force. He dominated it through operational discipline. He wanted predictable output, predictable transport, predictable costs, predictable supply. The only way to get that was consolidation, not for power, but for stability. Consolidation was a disciplined response to a systemized problem by the early 1870s, as Chernow writes. Rockefeller saw himself not as a but as a custodian of order in an industry incapable of imposing it on itself. And that's the big revelation. His discipline didn't just build wealth. It built an industry that had never been disciplined before. Everything that came next, Istandagioyes rise, its dominance, its innovations, traces back to this exact moment. As Rockefeller's empire expanded through the 1870s and 1880s, something becomes incredibly clear when you study the historical records, the testimonies of his partners, and the archival work done by Chernow and Nevins. Rockefeller's true superpower wasn't brilliance, aggression, or even vision. It was operational discipline at a scale no one had ever attempted. This is where the story gets really interesting, because most founders, once they reach a certain level of power and success, begin to loosen their discipline. They delegate more, trust the system to run itself, and drift into the comfort of success. Rockefeller did the opposite. The larger Standard Oil became, the more disciplined he became. The more chaos the industry produced, the more structure he imposed. The more money he earned, the more careful he grew about costs. And what's fascinating is that every biographer, even the ones who don't like him, agree on this one thing. Rockefeller's relentless discipline created an internal efficiency machine that no competitor could match. Let's go through a few examples, because these are the moments that reveal how he really operated. The discipline of extreme cost control. There's a passage in Titan that SE is so important. Chernow repeats it in multiple chapters. Rockefeller treated cost reduction as a moral obligation. He believed that finding a cheaper, smarter, more efficient way to do something. It wasn't just good business, it was the right thing to do. He once said, "I always tried to turn every disaster into an opportunity and every opportunity into a saving." Rockefeller tracked barrel prices, railroad rebates, waste percentages, byproduct yields, transportation, losses, labor efficiency, refinery output, consistency. His ledger books were weapons. They gave him perfect clarity about his operation in a world where his competitors were guessing. To the discipline of standardization. People forget that Standard Oil wasn't named by accident. Rockefeller believed that nothing scales without standardization. He created standardized barrels, standardized shipping practices, standardized refining procedures, standardized audits, standardized bookkeeping, standardized chemical processes in an era when most refineries produced wildly inconsistent kerosene, some explosive, some contaminated. Rockefeller made his product identical everywhere. That was discipline turned into branding. Tres, the discipline of planning 10 steps ahead, one of Rockefeller's most powerful habits. Mentioned in nearly every biography was his refusal to rush. He would sit quietly in meetings, hands folded, listening, thinking, and then, with calm certainty, he'd outline a plan more complete than anything his team had prepared. This wasn't intuition. It was the product of decades of deliberate, structured thinking. Rockefeller had trained himself to slow down when others sped up. Chernow calls this trait patience weaponized for the discipline of paying attention to microscopic details. One story I love, Rockefeller's chemists discovered that the waste petroleum sludge left at the bottom of the refining process, the stuff everyone else threw away, could be turned into lubricants, Vaseline, and dozens of profitable byproducts. While other refiners ignored sludge, Rockefeller monetized it. That is, discipline applied to curiosity, a refusal to waste anything, not even ideas. 5. The discipline of emotional self-mastery. Visitors would walk into Rockefeller SEO FAS during the most volatile periods of the oil market and expect to find panic. Instead, they found a man so calm it was unnerving. His voice stayed low, his posture stayed relaxed, his face remained blank. He didn't rush, he didn't react. He didn't fear. Nevins describes him perfectly in A World on Fire. Rockefeller moved as if he lived underwater. That emotional discipline became one of his greatest strategic advantages. By the late 1880s, Standard Oil wasn't winning because it was ruthless. It was winning because it was disciplined in a way no other company on earth was disciplined. Every refinery they owned ran with military precision. Every department kept immaculate records. Every division reported with accuracy. Every dollar had a purpose. Rockefeller didn't build Standard Oil with force. He built it with discipline. If you've been following Rockefeller's story chronologically, the way Nevins and the early biographers wrote it, you start to notice a striking pattern around the late 1880s and early 1890s. Rockefeller's discipline, which began as a personal trait and evolved into an operational system, eventually matured into something even more powerful, a philosophy of decision-making that governed every major move he made during the peak of Standard Oil. This is a part of the story most people miss. They focus on the antitrust battles, the federal investigations, the political controversies, but long before the government ever came for Standard Oil, Rockefeller had already built his fortune on principles that were shockingly consistent principles rooted in discipline. Yes, but also in how he made decisions when he made them, and why he avoided certain temptations that destroyed other Gilded Age titans. Let me walk you through some of these principles, because they appear over and over again in the archives. Rockefeller's discipline created a unique style of leadership, unlike Carnegie, who was fiery and boastful. Unlike Vanderbilt, who ruled by intimidation, unlike Gould, who embraced brinkmanship, Rockefeller led in a completely different way. He was methodical, quiet, unshakably patient. He didn't storm into rooms, he absorbed them. He didn't shout orders, he whispered them. And what's fascinating is this. Nearly every early Standard Oil employee describes him the same way. Unemotional, exacting, and endlessly consistent. Why does this matter? Because discipline creates predictability, and predictability creates trust. And trust in business compounds faster than money. Standard Oil didn't just have capital. It had confidence, and Rockefeller's discipline built that confidence. Discipline kept him out of ego battles that bankrupted his rivals. The Gilded Age was full of personal vendettas. Carnegie versus Frick. Vanderbilt versus Gould. Financial duels. Public insults. Ego wars. Rockefeller refused to participate. He avoided newspapers. He avoided public arguments. He avoided personal feuds. He avoided revenge. His discipline created a buffer between him and the chaos of his era. Biographer Alan Nevins wrote that Rockefeller possessed a genius for refusing distraction. That single trait may have saved him billions and kept Standard Oil stable while competitors imploded emotionally. 3. Discipline made him a master of pressure. Think about this. Rockefeller operated in a world of wildcat, violent price swings, financial panics, political attacks, lawsuits, and fierce competitors. Yet, his heartbeat never changed. There's a famous scene during the Panic of 1873. The market collapses. Banks fail. Refineries go bankrupt. Cleveland businessmen are shouting in the streets. Rockefeller, he goes ice skating on Lake Erie. Not because he didn't care, but because his discipline trained him not to react emotionally to short-term chaos. He trusted his ledgers more than the mood of the market. That's worldview level discipline. 4. Discipline allowed him to think in long-term arcs, while others focused on quarterly profits. Rockefeller thought in decades. He reinvested relentlessly. He prioritized stability over speed. He sacrificed short-term gain for long-term control. And when you look at Standard Oil's expansion pipelines, tank cars, warehouses, distribution centers, what you're really seeing is Rockefeller's discipline applied to infrastructure. He wasn't building a company. He was building a system that would survive any cycle. 5. Discipline even shaped his philanthropy. This is another part of the story people misunderstand. Rockefeller didn't wake up at 60 and suddenly decide to give away money. He practiced structured giving from his teenage years. He tithed from his first paycheck. He supported churches methodically. He tracked every donation as meticulously as every expense. His philanthropy wasn't an emotional impulse. It was an extension of his discipline. And that disciplined giving would later lead to The University of Chicago Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. Eradication of hookworm in the American South. Massive public health campaigns. Rockefeller didn't switch personalities when he became a philanthropist. He applied the same operating system, discipline, to transforming society. By the 1890s, Rockefeller's discipline had become a lens through which he viewed everything: people, opportunity, risk, capital allocation, and even morality. It was no longer just a habit. It was a worldview. When you reach the final chapters of Rockefeller's life, in the major biographies especially, Titan by Chernow, the narrative shifts in a surprising way. The story stops being about wealth, business, and power, and it becomes something much more intimate. An examination of what discipline does to a person over an entire lifetime. Because by the time Rockefeller entered his 70s, 80s, and even 90s, yes, he lived in 97. His business empire had already been dismantled by the Supreme Court. Standard Oil was broken into 34 companies. His name was dragged through newspaper headlines. He was portrayed as a villain, a monopolist, a robber baron. And yet none of it broke him. None of it unraveled him. None of it destabilized him. Why? Because the same discipline that built his fortune also built a mind that could survive his fortune being taken away. This is a part of the story that people rarely talk about, but it is, in many ways, the part that matters the most. Discipline gave Rockefeller psychological immunity when the antitrust battles peaked. His associates were panicking. Lawyers were frantically preparing defenses. Bankers were predicting collapse. The press was vicious. Congress was aggressive, and the courts were circling. Rockefeller spent the early mornings playing golf, not as a performance, not as but because his mind had been trained for decades to remain anchored while everything around him shook. Chernow writes that Rockefeller possessed an almost unearthly serenity, a calmness that seemed to come from some internal reservoir no crisis could drain. This wasn't luck. This wasn't temperament. This was discipline practiced for 70 years. He had built an inner world stronger than the outer one. 2. Discipline transformed his wealth into legacy. Most industrial titans spent their later years defending their reputations or trying to claw back public favor. Rockefeller did something different. He turned the same discipline systems that built Standard Oil into a disciplined system for philanthropy. He approached giving the way he approached refining, with structure, with consistency, with efficiency, with long-term thinking, with measurable results. The Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, the Rockefeller Institute, these were not gestures. They were engineered institutions, and they produced outcomes that rippled across decades. Groundbreaking medical research, the eradication of diseases, the advancement of higher education, public health infrastructure across the world. Rockefeller didn't donate money to feel generous. He donated money to maximize impact the same way he maximized yield in a refinery. This is what discipline looks like when it becomes moral conviction. 3. Discipline became his definition of freedom. People assume Rockefeller was driven by the pursuit of wealth, but when you read his letters, his journals, his interviews, and the accounts of those close to him, a different truth appears. Rockefeller didn't use discipline to get rich. Rockefeller used discipline to become free. Free from fear, free from chaos, free from panic, free from emotion-driven decisions, free from the instability of his childhood, free from dependency on luck, free from the unpredictable storms of business cycles. His fortune didn't create that freedom. His discipline did. For the final lesson, discipline outlasts everything else. When Rockefeller died in 1937, his companies continued to grow: Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California, companies that later became Exxon Mobil and Chevron. His foundations continued their work. His institutions continued their research. His influence continued its global reach. His money was enormous, but his discipline was immortal. And that's the point of this entire story. Rockefeller did not build his fortune on opportunities. He didn't build it on timing. He didn't build it on luck. He didn't build it on charisma. He built it on discipline, practiced so consistently, so ruthlessly, and so intelligently that it became the foundation of everything he touched. If you strip away the myths, if you strip away the controversies, if you strip away the corporate battles and the headlines, what remains is the real lesson. Rockefeller turned discipline into destiny. And once you understand that it becomes impossible to see his story or your own the same way again.